Chapter 28. Previously.
For a moment, the portal's strength died down, and everything was calm. Alistair's and Noah's power reduced to a minimum as they breathed and looked at me. Suddenly, I felt a span of pain through my body. I felt as I was heating up, and I screamed at the aching. Every inch of me was in pain, and I felt like I was dying.
Ariana!
I heard Alistair scream before everything around me drowns in darkness.
Alistair, point of view. Ariana! I screamed as I ran to her. Before her body hits the ground, Vicus was able to catch her since he was closer. He settled her on the floor as I reached beside her. Aria? I called her, but she didn't respond. She was breathing, though it was very faint.
Mommy! Wake up, Mommy!
Noah was crying and shaking her hand.
Was conducting the ceremony too much for her?
Hala asked as she started to check on her pulse. I stared at Ariana in horror. Oh no. It must be true, isn't it? A human has never conducted the ceremony. I knew I should have gone against her doing it. The ceremony was too powerful. She must have exerted too much stress on herself. The doctor's on the way, Vicus said as I nodded. I put my hand on her chest and tried to share some energy, but I felt pain course through my body when my magic was forced back on my body. Shit! She is rejecting my strength, I cursed. The trial portal! I heard one of the people shout, grabbing my attention. The portal once again shined, indicating the ending of the visit to the Lord Vamir's chamber. Go. Finish the ceremony. I will look after her, Vicus said as I hesitantly nodded. I kissed her forehead and then of my crying son. I squeezed my son's hand with an encouraging smile before looking at my unconscious queen. I gave her to Vicus and then made my way to my position. I closed my eyes and concentrated as I raised my hand. I called forth the power of the king, and the familiar, overexerting power filled my body as I glowed blue. I started to feel the strain and tiredness, but I tried hard to ignore it. The process must be completed, or else the decision of Lord Vamir will be nullified. But my body still feels weak. I could feel my energy being drained as my power kept increasing. Suddenly, I felt a surge of warmth fill my body. It was familiar, just like before, and I didn't need to open my eyes to know that my son is behind me, sharing his powers to me. His power flowed through my body, and I felt the energy increase as my body came to ease. I started to chant the spell, opening the portal more brightly, and I watched as two of the elders were thrown out the portal. Shock filled me as Vitalia and Salaki looked inside the portal in horror. Kalimir walked out the portal, his eyes filled with anger. His power was activated, his eyes shining red and his hands bound by his power. But I noticed one thing, and I'm sure everyone else did too. He no longer bears the mark of Elder. His arm, where the mark lies, is now burnt with blood around them. I lost my position because you both justified against me, he shouted as the two look at him in horror. Something doesn't make sense. Now that he is not in power, surely the other two elders are powerful. They can easily kill Calimere, but nothing. They seem to be weak and tired.
Papa?
I heard my son call, and I turned around in shock, seeing my son sweating and breathing hard. I then noticed myself in the same stage as his. The portal, it's draining our power. I closed my eyes and commanded for the closure of the portal, and it slowly started to dim before completely vanishing. Hala suddenly got hold of my son, who fell weak on his knees, while I jumped down to the arena where the elders stood. Calimere, you are no longer an elder. You have been stripped out of your title, and now you must leave the palace courtyard to live among the people, I said as he glared at me. Why must I be stripped off my title? You are the man who abandoned the kingdom for that weak human, he shouted, pointing at Ariana. This is not my decision, but that of Lord Vamir. You dare defy him? I asked back as his face morphed to more and more anger. I don't care about that one-sided god. He only listened to these brats. I was the eldest for the longest of times. I was the eldest since your father's rule. I have more power than you, he shouted at me as Grasp echoed around.
My king. He has joined with the Dark Wizard. He has absorbed our power. He is too powerful,
Vitalia warned me. My eyes widened in shock as his face turned more and more into a successful smirk. That is right, and you are weak, he said as he raised his hand. A large fireball formed in his hands that were directed at us. I quickly put on a shield defending the fire. Even though I was successful, the force knocked me backwards.
Papa!
Noah shouted as he ran to me. Noah, go back, I shouted, but he was beside me, glaring at Calimere. Perfect. Killing the king and the prince ends up in end of the rule of Regmors, he said as he conjured his powers. His hands were raised in the air, and a storm was forming on it. The thunder was purple, and although it looked small, I knew how powerful it was. Even if it's his most powerful spell, I could have easily overcome it. But right now, my powers are too weak. I am not strong enough to dodge him. I looked at Vicus, and he was struggling to come to me, of course. The bastard has put a restraining spell on them. Bye-bye, he said as my eyes wide. Noah! I shouted as I covered my body over his. I felt the bright light directed at me, and I closed my eyes, the fear of death instantly clouding my mind. But it never reached. I felt a wave of wind pass by me before a familiar voice shouted out the protection spell.
Protect Yanal!
She shouted as I opened my eyes to see a silver shield cover us. My head snapped to the person in front of me, and I grasped, not believing the thing I am seeing. This is a dream, right? Because if it is not, I know I is going crazy seeing my queen in front of me, casting the protection spell. She only had one hand raised in front of her, the silver power flowing out. Her long brown hair was floating in the air due to the forceful wind. I reached out to look at her eyes, and it was also silver and glowing. Looking at Calimere, I understood that he too was in shock. He broke his spell and glared at her before running forward with his activated power. Arya too started to run towards him, and once they were close enough, they jumped in the air and fought with speed and magic. I watched in shock as they attack and retracted, back and forth, and it looks like shooting stars fighting. In the end, Calimere, which is the red light, was crashing down to the ground. Arya in silver light on top of him. Once he crashed into the ground, Ariana used her final power, shouting out an unfamiliar spell.
You have defined the law of Lord Vamir. You are found to disrespect not only your king, but the land and your creator. Calimere Solace, under the verdict of Lord Vamir, I hereby declare you exiled into the depth of the dimension of void.
She said, her voice dripping in power. The silver light in her hand turned copper gold before she cast it on him. The man screamed and disintegrated into thin air. The whole crowd was silent and shock. We watched in anticipation. What would happen next? She turned and looked at me and Noah, her eyes still glowing silver. She slowly walked to us, her face in trace. Once she reached me, her eyes rolled back as she fell on my arm, unconscious.